Welcome back to the Econ Department seminar. If you have not gotten your write-up back from me, please do see me at the end. We have one more seminar this term. That's Radhika Balakrishnan coming in 2 weeks from today, speaking on human rights outcomes and as a strategy for evaluating macroeconomic policies. Paul Volcker speaking tonight. If any of you have a ticket, it's probably not a cheap event, but it might be well worth trying to get yourself in or pulling any strings if you know anything about student prices, anything like that. I don't think we have otherwise any other economic seminars I'm aware of that you can do as alternative write-ups this term. So do let me know if you hear or think of something. But right now, I think you absolutely must write up each of these seminars. Okay. Any questions or issues? Okay, well, you're in luck today. We have with us John Romalis here from the University of Chicago. He's originally Australian, did his undergraduate work in Australia, and then his PhD at MIT. He's been at the University of Chicago since then. He works in the macroeconomics and trade group there in the business school. He's presenting today a paper on trade and the global recession. He also has quite a line of work that we questioned closely about over lunch, which is very interesting about increasing income inequality and price dispersion and quality of goods, and so what it really means for how accurate the CPI is for people in different segments of the income distribution. So look for that. What he'll be presenting today is trade and the global recession, and he's happy to take questions as he goes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. And it's good to know I have to compete with Paul Volcker in my presentation today, so hopefully I come even vaguely close to his standards. It should be all right. So this work is with a number of co-authors, Jonathan Eaton at Penn State, and two of my co-authors from the University of Chicago. And as the title says, it's on the experience of trade in the global recession. With the onset of the global recession, now almost 2 years ago, something very pronounced happened to international trade. Virtually every country experienced a very sharp drop in the levels of international trade, such that levels of international trade in relation to the total sizes of their economies tended to contract quite rapidly. So here's what's happened to trade divided by the GDP, or size of those countries' economies, for the 4 largest economies in the world. And what you see is that a very sharp contraction in the United States, a sharp one in Japan, a big one in China, and a reasonably sizable one in Germany. And this is something that was even more true of many smaller countries as well. And so each of these individual shocks was often the largest decline in trade to GDP that each of these countries had experienced since the Second World War. But what was actually unusual also was just how synchronized these shocks were across countries. So that basically month by month, trade to GDP was contracting rapidly at all countries across the world. Yes?
Just real quick, is that total volume of trade or net exports?
Total volume of trade.
Okay.
It's actually imports plus exports, just measured in local currency terms, multiplied by 0.5, so you get the average of the two, divided by the dollar, also local currency value of the GDP. So when you actually add up to a worldwide measure, this is what happened to the value of trade to GDP on a worldwide basis. So from a peak in early 2008 to the trough in the middle of 2009, the value of trade to GDP on a worldwide basis fell by almost 40%. This was by far the largest decline in the post-war period, by far the sharpest decline in recorded history. So essentially, in that 9-month period where trade declined by almost 40% relative to GDP, during the Great Depression it took 2 years to achieve the same decline in trade to GDP. So this is something that tended to puzzle a large number of economists. But at first I wasn't that puzzled because I'd been dealing with trade, the relationship of trade to GDP in some of my lectures for a long time. Because the first thing that struck my mind was that, well, trade does not look much like GDP at all. So if you think of GDP, each country's economy is dominated by services. So for example, in the United States, services account for almost 80% of the size of the total economy. International trade, on the other hand, is dominated by goods. So in international trade, 75% of what is traded are actually goods rather than services. So that's an important thing. The composition is quite different. Now, even amongst trading goods, trade doesn't look very much like the economy as a whole either, because trade is very intensive in two types of goods, which the economy as a whole is less intensive in. The first is commodities. So like oil being an obvious one, but other metals and raw materials are an extremely large part of international trade, but they're usually only a small part of the size of an individual economy. And what we know when there's a downturn in the business cycle is that the prices of commodities fall very rapidly whenever there's a downturn. And so the oil price fell by 50%. The prices of things like iron ore and other metal commodities also fell by about 50% with the onset of the recession. Now, the other thing that international trade is very rich in is durable goods. So international trade is very rich in things like automobiles, for instance, and also the investment goods that businesses invest in when they wish to create new jobs and new factories. And what happens is that with durable goods, demand for the quantities of durable goods is extremely sensitive to the business cycle. When people feel a little bit poorer for whatever reason, what they will want to do is adjust their durable goods stock. And so, for instance, they might decide they're going to keep their Toyota for an extra year, or if they do trade it in at the normal time, they might downgrade to a Hyundai rather than buying a Toyota the next time around. And that is something that when people postpone their purchases has an enormous effect on the trade in durable goods if everybody's postponing at roughly the same time. The same is true of investment as well. When the economy begins to slacken, businesses tend to postpone investment decisions. So you see this massive simultaneous downturn in business demand for investment goods, and that is something that hits international trade very substantially because international trade is extremely rich in investment goods also. So my first reaction was that it's this compositional issues that have behind this very sharp fall in trade and GDP. But not all of my colleagues tended to agree. So you found a wide debate about the severity of decline in the international trade. And it was very puzzling to many, including some of the most seasoned economists that are actually out there. So Barry Eichengreen, who's extensively studied business cycles, in particular the Great Depression, was someone who found this big decline in international trade terrifying because he didn't understand the decline in international trade. Symposiums were organized whereby economists could discuss what was behind this massive decline in trade and GDP, and books were produced very quickly where leading economists put forward their views, not yet rigorously tested in research, as to what were behind the declines in trade and GDP. So there's two basic stories out there. So one of the stories is going to be a composition story. So essentially, that the big decline in trade was mostly because of the nature of the products traded, and that nothing else untoward is happening. But there's competing stories out there that said, well, actually something a little bit nasty is going on in the background with international trade. Countries are either explicitly or a little more surreptitiously adding extra barriers to international trade. That is something that might help deepen the recession. And I guess economists were a little bit spooked by the experience of the Great Depression, when countries very clearly raised barriers to international trade through, for example, raising of tariff barriers, through the abandonment of convertibility of their currencies, for example, and other restrictions. So trade frictions are the other category. So one thing that I first thought of is that, well, there's a lot of debate out here. So we have to work out, is it going to be worthwhile to actually write a paper on this, or is the answer going to be obvious? So I did a little bit of exploratory research to begin with, and one of the things was to recognize, well, the types of goods that trade in tend to be very cyclical in nature. So is anything unusual about this particular cycle? So if you look to the United States, for instance, and take a long history, so looking at United States quarterly data going back to 1960, This graph here is just plotting something very simple for the United States. On this axis here is a very crude measure of the business cycle. It's the 4-quarter-ended changes in real GDP in percentage points. On this axis here is a very crude measure of how trade tends to respond to the business cycle. So that's the 4-quarter change in non-energy imports in the US relative to GDP. Now what you can clearly see is a fairly close or obvious statistical relationship between these two things. That is, when GDP does poorly, trade, at least non-oil trade to GDP, also does exceptionally poorly. So when GDP declines by 2%, you tend to expect a roughly 10 to 15% decline in the amount of non-oil imports to GDP. So if you look at this graph here, the pre-Great Recession observations are the blue circles. The Great Recession observations are the red squares. The only thing that stands out is that it's an extremely nasty recession. But conditional on how nasty this recession has been, trade appears to be responding normally to the severity of the recession. So that would tend to lend support to the fact that whatever is going on in this recession is not abnormal. The only thing abnormal is the depth of the recession itself. But then you look to some other countries and perform a similar exercise for other countries. And you begin to see some that don't look like the normal relationship. So here's Japan, for example. And what you take from the pre-recession relationship is that there's actually not a lot of relationship between their trade to GDP and what's going on with their GDP. If you take the Great Recession, clearly there is a relationship now. So with this very severe decline in Japanese real GDP, was associated with a very large, even larger decline in their non-oil imports to GDP. So some countries look like this, and results like this tend to suggest that actually something atypical is happening for these countries during this recession. So when we see some preliminary evidence like that, then that suggests, well, maybe we have an interesting paper to write, because the answer wasn't as obvious as what I first thought. But something more than just the composition of trade is actually driving the results. So what could be more than the composition of trade? The other explanations are things that we group together in a category we call trade frictions. So if trade is declining by more than economic output, then one possible cause of that is that the barriers to international transactions have risen by more than the barriers to purely domestic transactions. So therefore, the frictions to international business have increased. So one set of these frictions which authors have focused on are trade finance. So if anybody looks into how international trade gets financed, you'll actually notice that there's more underlying financial transactions than there are with just financing purely domestic trade. More banks, more instruments involved in doing this. So therefore, there's the potential for greater fragility in international trade financing arrangements than there are in purely domestic financing arrangements. So this first paper is actually probably the most interesting of those two to read. It's just come out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics as a forthcoming paper. And that paper was dealing with a previous banking crisis, one that was present for Japan. So Japan has had a hopeless banking system for a long time. And what these authors did was look to a period when a lot of the Japanese banks essentially imploded, or in more colourful language, became what were known as zombie banks. And these authors obtained some very good data on the relationship between major Japanese companies and their banks. And what they found was that the Japanese companies that were most connected to these zombie or failing banks had a much inferior export performance in subsequent years than the Japanese companies that were associated with the healthier Japanese banks. And therefore, they provided some convincing evidence that, at least for Japan, that trade finance was potentially an important role for actual export. And because of the obvious developments in the financial system in the Great Recession, that is something that was very timely researched, because it suggested an implosion in your financial system could in fact be behind this declining trade to GDP. Another paper that uses inferior data to tell a similar story is actually by Chor and Manova, and they're looking at US data. They look at detailed US imports from a variety of countries, and they find two things. They find that US imports from countries that experienced a greater tightening in credit conditions fell more rapidly. And the fall was most rapid in the products where there's a greater demand for external finance for producing or trading those products. So that is less good, but still very interesting evidence of the role of trade finance, that the trade finance might have had a role in these particular findings. A larger group of authors is actually focused on outright protection. So many countries have actually enacted some small protectionist measures, so raised barriers like trade, tariffs or quantitative restrictions on imports. But for the most part, my reading of most of these restrictions, they are pinpricks rather than hammer blows to international trade. So for example, one that got a lot of attention was the United States decided to put a 30% tariff on imports of rubber tires from China. Now that's a reasonably sizable product, however its overall effect on US trade is relatively minor. And you would have to have many hundreds of these sort of pinpricks to add up to a large effect on international trade. So others said, well, maybe these barriers are being imposed in more surreptitious fashions. So what many countries did with the onset of the Great Recession was to try and fiscally stimulate themselves out of the problem. And so one of the things that countries did was they'd come up with these fiscal stimulus packages, and inside the US package, for example, and they weren't the only ones, were these Buy American provisions. So if the US was going to build a major new public works project, these provisions said that the steel and a lot of the other materials had to be purchased from US firms and not from imported firms. So that is indirectly a trade friction, because it's something that locks a major purchaser away from potential imports, thereby raising the barriers to international trade. Other authors focused on the nature of international trade itself. Increasingly, when you look at modern manufactured products that are traded across borders, you see this increasing fragmentation of the production process. So you take your favorite electronic gizmo, so presumably it'll have an Apple on it for many of you. So whether it's an iPod or an iPad, what you'll find is that many of the components of that product have crossed borders multiple times. Now this produces a problem for economists, potentially, because we're measuring the relationship between trade, which is measured as a gross flow. So every time an iPod or a component crosses a border, the full dollar value of that goes into the trade measure, against GDP, which you might remember from your first year macro is measured as value added. And so with this increasing vertical disintegration of production, you find that there's a higher ratio of gross flows to value added. So what happens when you stop buying an iPod? Well, that immediately produces multiple contractions in international trade. You stop buying an iPod. It means that an iPod is no longer sent from China to you. It means intellectual property payments that go back to the United States are no longer made as well. China, however, doesn't produce most of the components inside the iPod, so it then stops immediately purchasing some of the major chips and the screens from Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, and those companies as well stop making intellectual property payments to firms in the United States. So your one decision to not buy this iPod, which would have only added a little bit or taken a little bit off the GDP of, say, the United States, immediately results in this cascade of reductions in international trade because of the increased fragmentation of international trade. So this author thought that this might have been partly part of the problem. Another set of authors were focusing on inventory decisions. For example, many firms keep large inventories of products to sell to customers. The thing they dread is having a stock out because that often results in a lost sale. So these inventories aren't randomly held. The firms are presumably optimizing their holdings of inventories. And it turns out if it's more costly to, say, import a Toyota than it is to, say, just ship a product from Michigan, then what happens is that in the face of a recession, you're going to get a disproportionately large rundown of inventories of imported products relative to inventories of domestically sourced products. And these authors looked at this particularly for the motor vehicle industry in the United States and found evidence in support of that. Yes?
When you look at the various factors you're listing here, it seems to me, kind of going back to your initial question, what is different this time from previous declines in trade? It's really the fragmentation issue that is, in a sense, fundamentally new. The others, like protectionism, rundown of imported inventories, all of that has basically been around for a long time.
Now the question is not precisely what is different this time from previous recessions. It's what has caused this big decline in trade and GDP. At the very end, we'll actually then return to the question, is this unusual, say, relative to previous recessions? But you're right, if you're asking what is peculiar to this time around, then you're probably right that this is the thing that's increased importance the most. Right? What we'll actually find, though, is that what went on in this recession was mostly a demand-driven story. Just bringing forward a slide a little bit. And that's not unusual for recent recessions. So we actually look at the previous recession, so just after 2001, and find a similar story. But if you look back through time and say, look through to, say, the Great Depression, you find that wasn't always the story. So the question here is what caused this decline in trade and GDP? Not so much, is this different from other recessions, even though that's an interesting question. Okay. So let's look to, so the other story, as I said, is a composition story. This graph should actually be produced a little differently. It should start with the bottom panels. So here, we know that spending on goods is very cyclical. So here we're just looking in the US, you've got this same long history, 4-quarter changes in GDP, but this time it's associated with total manufacturing spending in the US and both durable and non-durable goods relative to GDP. And what you see is that whenever there's a recession, people stop buying goods. In particular, that's true of durable goods, but to a lesser extent it's true of less durable goods like clothing, for instance. And so this time around, again, there's nothing hugely different from the normal cycle. Japan, the same things tend to be true. In a recession, people buy fewer goods, and there seems to be nothing unusual about what's happened to demand for manufacturing as a whole compared to, say, previous relationships then. Because this black line here, I should explain, that is a regression line that is estimated with the pre-recession data only. So if these red dots lie on near the black line, it says we're fitting the prior relationship continues to hold. The top panel then says, well, how does this relate to the import side? So manufacturing demand falls. Remember, traded goods are disproportionately manufactured products. Therefore, it's not surprising to see in the US that the imports to GDPs fall rapidly as well. In Japan, the story is a little bit different. Manufacturing demand is contracting roughly at the rate you'd expect given the severity of the recession, maybe a little bit worse than normal. But basically, non-energy imports, so manufacturing imports predominantly, have actually contracted by much more than normal. And what that would suggest at first glance is that the Japanese are stopping spending on manufacturing at the normal rate. But for some reason, a disproportionate burden of that reduction is falling on imports. So maybe the trade friction story has some legs to it. So therefore, there is some loose evidence in support of both of the broad stories. So what we need to do is develop a model that will enable us to separate out between those stories. In fact, we need a model that's worldwide, because clearly there's each country's experience has actually been quite different, and we need a model that can potentially encompass all of these competing explanations of the decline in international trade, whether it's the various trade friction stories or whether it's the demand composition story. So we're actually going to start from one of the leading models of international trade. And one of the leading models of international trade was written by two of my co-authors, Jonathan Eaton and Sam Corton. And we're going to modify that model to suit our particular purposes. Because if you've studied in-depth international trade models, these are basically models of the long run. So they make assumptions about things like technology, factor supplies, preferences, in order to work out, well, in equilibrium, what happens to things like production, trade, wages, prices. They're not really designed to ask questions about, well, what happens if you have a short-term demand shock or something like that. So we're going to modify this model to enable us to identify, I'll use the term a little loosely, certain short-term shocks to the structure of demand. So in the trade model, you ordinarily wouldn't see a reduction in demand for, say, durable goods. So we actually have to allow for that. We also need to have shocks to allow shocks to trade deficits. In an ordinary trade model, you have some form of trade balance condition. It doesn't mean that trade has to be exactly balanced, but you need some form of condition to solve that model. Here, we're going to actually let the model fit the actual data for the evolution of trade deficits. We're going to use that model in order to identify changes in productivity and the trade frictions. You take a trade model and you input, normally you make assumptions about, well, here's the underlying technology, here are the trade frictions. That gives you predictions about trade shares and a whole host of other endogenous variables. We're going to turn it around a little bit. We're going to say we're going to impose some structure, but then we're going to say let's take the evolution of these trade shares and other endogenous variables to tell us what must have happened to things like trade frictions and productivity in our model to explain those changes in trade shares. And then once we identify changes to these factors here, we can use an accounting framework to say, well, what is the contribution of each of those factors on either a worldwide basis or a country-by-country basis to explain the developments in trade to GDP. The model has to be an input-output model because essentially to account for this growing vertical fragmentation of production. And unfortunately, from a data collection perspective, we need high-frequency data because the big decline in international trade began in late 2008 and began to turn around in the middle of 2009. So if you just use annual data, we're going to miss the key features of what went on. So we actually have to construct, in many cases, monthly data because some of the necessary data for our model doesn't actually exist at a monthly level. We have to construct it from related series. So we get our model. We then say, let's let our model perfectly fit the data that we have. And so by letting it perfectly fit the data, that's how we infer changes in things like trade frictions and productivity, for example. And then we take those parameters, those estimates of those shocks in the model, perfectly fitting the data, to perform an accounting exercise to work out the importance of these different shocks. And so that's an exercise that's a little related to this business cycle accounting paper, but it's not the same methodology. Okay. And what we find, so that if you decide that you, so this is the key finding. On a worldwide basis, dominant contribution to the decline in trade to GDP is through our demand factors. What we've done here we're looking at four-quarter ended changes in each case here. The black line is actually the change in trade to GDP on a four-quarter ended basis. So leading up to the Great Recession, there's just this very modest decline in the black line, which is unusual. Normally you get a secular increase in that line. But with the onset of the crisis, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, what you found was that very quickly trade to GDP on a four-quarter ended basis was declining extremely rapidly. Bottoming at sometime in the middle of 2009, the situation ceased to get progressively worse sometime at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010. So that's the data on changes in trade to GDP on a four-quarter ended basis. The red line says, let's run a counterfactual, and let's, once we've identified all of these shocks that have happened on a worldwide basis, let's just add up the demand shocks alone and their contribution. The red line explains roughly 80% of that decline, however we measure it. And about 2/3 of the decline alone is due to demand shocks for durable goods. Consumers deciding that they're not going to purchase motor vehicles, producers deciding to postpone investment in equipment. The other factors together explain about 20%. So that is the bottom line of the paper. On the whole, it is a demand story, a change in the composition of demand. So in the onset of the recession, consumers buy less goods, producers invest in less equipment, and since trade is extremely heavy in those types of goods, the trade to GDP ratio declines as a result of that. Okay. So now I'm going to get a little into the guts of the, actually, sorry, I lied. Now I go to some other related work. There's a lot of other papers out here. With a phenomenon that large, you're going to get a lot of authors looking at this. So we haven't been alone. So the Levchenko paper is just using detailed US data. The advantage of using detailed data is that you can very clearly identify some of the effects. The disadvantage is that it's very hard to match detailed data across countries, so you tend to just focus on one country. Since each country could have had a very different experience, you can't tell a global story. These guys try to tell a global story. They have a simpler but related structure to ours, and they seem to find that demand is the biggest part of the story as well. Loss of policy-oriented literature, so governments wonder how much they have to worry about this. But what's relatively unique about ours is that there's very few papers that have tried to put together a global story. And this is the only paper that tries to do it within the context of a modern international trade model, the things that every graduate student learns when they study international trade. So the precursor to our model is actually that trade model itself. That's actually a really nice paper to read when you're studying graduate international trade. That model has been used for interesting purposes. So for instance, Fernando Alvarez and Bob Lucas used that model to try and say, well, if countries eliminated their tariff barriers, what would be the gains to economic welfare if countries did that? So that gives you an idea of the flexibility of this model. These authors here, it's actually Deffel, Eaton, and Kortum, they use the Eaton and Kortum model to say, we know in the world there are a lot of what are referred to as trade imbalances. If all of a sudden, for whatever reason, trade had to become balanced, what would be the decline in things like GDP, trade, and welfare amongst a whole set of countries? Again, taking this model and having an interesting application of it. The closest paper in structure to ours would be this one here. They also take an Eaton and Kortum model, but they use it to estimate the gains or losses from NAFTA. And this is the paper on inventories I talked to you about earlier. So there's a lot of related work. We're not unique. What is unique is that this is the only one that takes a modern general equilibrium trade model to explain the global trade experience. Okay. Now we have to get into a little bit of accounting. Okay. In each case, have some assumption about how products are produced. The simplicity of the Eaton-Quarter model, which is also a limitation of the model, is that it assumes that products are produced using labor alone combined with intermediate inputs. There's no other factor of production like capital or entrepreneurship or anything like that. It's labor and intermediate inputs. Furthermore, that labor is perfectly mobile across sectors. So the beauty of that is that it makes it relatively easy to solve these types of models. We're going to extend that model to 3 different sectors. The traditional Eaton-Quarter model is just a one-sector model. So here we're going to say we know that broad sectors of the economy have changed, have behaved differently. In particular, we know that there's been a lot of action with durable goods, less action with non-durable goods, so that's things like food and clothing, for instance, and even less action with services. So essentially, services are things such as like housing services, are the biggest one, that are effectively unaffected by the Great Recession. They might have caused the Great Recession, but they remain not much affected by it. So what we're going to assume is that at this sector level, there are Cobb-Douglas production technologies and preferences. So this leads us to our first accounting equation. That the total demand in country I for goods in sector J, so this could be durable goods for example, is given by the sum of 2 things. One is by final demand for these products. The term in here is actually gross national expenditure. So this is wages multiplied by the labor force. But remember, we only have one factor of production. So wages multiplied by the labor force is gross domestic product. This is the deficit. So this is giving you how much do you spend beyond your income. So you sum those 2 things together and you have gross national expenditure. This is a very important parameter. We don't necessarily think of it as a deep demand parameter, certainly not in a traditional trade model, but this is the fraction of final expenditures in country I that are spent on sector J goods, so durable goods. And so what you see in recessions is that this thing tends to go down because durable goods demand tends to fall more rapidly than demand for other products. So that's final demand for that product. This is intermediate goods demand for that product in that country. That's output of that sector in that country across the 3 different sectors. That is the labor demand. So this is actually, or generally this is what we call value added. So beta is a number between 0 and 1 that says what is the share of value added in this sector here. Normally that refers to payments to labor and payments to capital. Here it's just payments to labor. So 1 minus beta is intermediate goods usage. And this gamma coefficient here tells you the intermediate goods usage in this country, so that how much that sector there demands of intermediate goods from that particular sector there. Now there's almost nothing like input-output analysis to send you to sleep, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I think the only thing that sends people to sleep more rapidly than input-output analysis is talking about the Hector-Alleen model of international trade. So fortunately we don't have to do that at all. Okay. So that's the production. The production technology is embedded in here because the Cobb-Douglas assumption is effectively embedded in this gamma and beta coefficients because these are shares of expenditure. So saying the substitution elasticity is 1. This thing here again is share of expenditure. So the Cobb-Douglas in preferences is effectively embedded there. So this actually gives cost functions to produce a particular good that relate to wage rates, and the prices is the intermediate inputs. And that turns out to be an important thing to keep track of in the background. Yes?
Does your total demand mean you only get imports, domestic inputs?
No.
Intermediate goods?
No. What happens is that this tells you how many intermediate inputs you need. What we assume is that later on we'll tell you where you get those intermediate inputs from. So at the moment, there's going to be a set of conditions that say you need enough intermediate inputs to produce produce this thing. That's obviously one of our equilibrium conditions. Later on, we'll have a set of trade share conditions that tell you where you're going to get these things from. Okay. So we need a lot of data for this. Fortunately, the OECD produces a lot of input-output tables, not just for industrial countries, but also for large developing countries as well. And it's usually split up by what's known as the International SIC classification. And we just pick off the durable parts of this classification, the non-durable manufacturing parts of this classification, and we throw everything else into non-manufacturing, which we denote S for services, even though it's not all services. So all agriculture and raw materials and construction gets thrown into this non-manufacturing group. So we end up with a lot of information on the input-output structure. So what intermediate inputs you need and what labor inputs you need in each country to produce each of these products here. Okay. In each country, you'll find that the input-output structure is not the same across countries. So countries have different shares of value added, for instance, and those shares may have in fact changed over time. So we need to keep track of this because since countries have different input-output structures, that's an important thing to keep track of when we're actually accounting for the decline in trade and GDP. Now another thing which if I went through in great detail would be supremely boring is that we're not interested in the service sector. The service sector is, most of the action here is in the goods producing sector, and also since it's not easy to get the service trade we need at the frequency that we need, we decide we're not going to pay much attention to services. So essentially we're going to integrate it out. And what we do, and just going to let it equilibrate in the background, doesn't mean we can entirely get rid of them. But consistent with our model, we can construct equations for the prices of producing these individual services. And then we say, well, what is that relevant for? For our purposes, the main relevance of the services is that they are also used as an intermediate input in manufacturing production. So we actually end up modeling services for the most part as an intermediate input that the manufacturers themselves produce. That requires some modification to the structure of the model. So you notice we've put a squiggly line over some of these parameter estimates here. But it also means, apart from that, the only vestige of the service sector is the deficit in services, which since we can measure that as data, we simply take as exogenous, and we never have to talk about the service sector again. So that is something that makes our life a lot simpler because it greatly simplifies the data collection, and it also greatly simplifies the computation of this model. And when you do research, both of those things are very valuable, especially when you need to revise these things again, because something that already takes a week to solve could easily blow out to 4 weeks if you added extra detail. Okay. It's a global model. So we can have a model with any number of countries that we like. That will be mostly determined by data availability. We can get our full set of data for about 60 countries. But it turns out not all of those countries trade with each other all of the time. And that is a problem for our model. So therefore, we aggregate some of those countries into a rest of the world. And we ended up dealing with 20-odd countries. So the US is not one we aggregate with the rest of the world. It's interesting enough to keep separate. My own country we do throw in with the rest of the world because it's not interesting enough to keep separate. So most European and larger developing countries end up being separate. Smaller countries we aggregate together. Something that is very critical to our analysis is going to be this variable here. This is a trade share. And this trade share is the share of country N's expenditures. So to memorize this more easily, say this is the share of the Netherlands' expenditures in sector J, say that's durable goods, that they import from India. Right? So that is a critical trade share. It's something that we can get in the data very regularly. And it's something we're going to use to identify a lot of what's going on. So what happens is that The first thing we're going to use it for is to define our market clearing conditions. There's no inventories in our model, so nothing at all. So therefore, anything that's produced has to be absorbed. So production, which is equal to demand, so total demand, so that should be minus the deficit. Production is total demand minus the deficit, has to be something that's absorbed in all of the countries. So essentially, for that to be true, is that for total production to be absorbed, final demand in each country in that sector multiplied by this trade share, so that's that country's demand for Indian goods in sector J has to add up to Indian output in sector J. Indian output has to be allocated across the world. There's nothing sitting that remains undemanded. There's no inventories in this model. Okay. So then, our model becomes about what determines trade shares. And this is the core of the model. International trade models, one of the things they're naturally designed to spit out, even if that's not the most interesting thing about them, is the pattern of international trade. So therefore, a broad class of international trade models will spit out predictions about international trade shares. And so our particular model, how many people here have studied international trade? Like, do they know of a Ricardian, who knows of the Ricardian model? I don't know how basic I have to get my presentation to. Okay, all right. So this is going to make it hard. So our model is, it's a Ricardian type model of international trade. And this is a model that goes back centuries and essentially explains trade flows based on this concept of comparative advantage, which is driven by relative productivity differences. So countries end up producing and exporting products at which they're relatively good at producing. It sounds natural enough. So even if a country like, say, the United States has high productivity in everything, it doesn't mean it'll end up producing and exporting everything. So what ends up happening is that market forces compel it to export the products where its relative productivity is highest. And so it ends up exporting things like Intel chips and advanced business services, and importing things like textiles and clothing and call center services. So that's sort of the Ricardian model. It's a very simple model because it only has one factor of production, workers, so we don't have to worry about nasty things like capital and other factors of production. So what happens is that countries buy from the cheapest source. So products are essentially, in this particular model, every country can actually produce every product. So this particular watch here, even though it's made in Switzerland, theoretically every country could produce this particular watch. However, the costs of producing that watch in every country aren't equal. They're going to be given by a product of three things. The cost of the bundle of inputs required to produce the product, so the labor and the intermediate inputs required to produce that watch. Also, the trade costs. If I'm going to ship that from Switzerland, the cost might be different from if I ship it from Australia. So that variable there gives us the trade costs. So the bigger is D, the more expensive it is to ship from that particular country. But then there's this other variable here, which is the key to the Ricardian model, and that's the productivity. What also, essentially you take a bundle of inputs, and you say, well, how effectively do the workers use that particular bundle of inputs? And so the more productive the workers are, the fewer bundles of inputs you need to produce that watch, and the cheaper it is to produce that watch. Now, the beautiful thing about the Eden and Korda model was the assumption about what they said about the distribution of these productivities here. And they make this assumption here that the probability that your productivity, sorry, I shouldn't stick my tongue out in the video, the probability that your productivity is less than a given value is given by this double exponential distribution here. It depends on this technology parameter here, and also this parameter here, which tells you how dispersed productivity differences are between countries. So you don't need a deep understanding of that particular model to understand what's going on. But essentially, countries that tend to get good draws of productivity are much more likely to export that product to you. In fact, the nice thing about this assumption here is that it makes it very easy to construct what in statistics are known as order statistics. So it makes it very easy for you to work out what is the probability that you're the best, that you are the lowest cost supplier of a particular product. And that probability, since we assume that there are billions of goods out there, gives you the trade shares. So the trade share between, let's say, from the Netherlands buying from India in this sector is governed by those assumptions there. The higher the productivity in India, the more likely that the Netherlands buys from India. The higher the cost of inputs in India, the less likely the Netherlands buys from India. The larger the trade cost between the Netherlands and India, the less likely, there's a minus sign there, you are to buy from India. But how much the Netherlands buys from India doesn't just depend on those assumptions for India alone. It depends on all of the competing options. So you perform the same calculation for all other countries that are supplying those particular products. So now you begin to see how quickly this model could explode if we don't make simplifying assumptions. So that is a critical equation in the model. You can get similar equations from models of a class known as gravity trade models, but we use this one for the obvious reason that two of my co-authors are eating with corn. So that's why we use that. Nothing deep about that. Okay. And also, these assumptions here give rise to a particular price index, which I won't go into detail of. Okay. Now we get to equilibrium. You might thank me for simplifying this slide a lot. So what happens is that in the normal trade model, when you learn international trade in an undergraduate or graduate class, you're going to make some assumptions about supply, production technologies, the availability of factors, and also trade costs, for example. You're going to add in assumptions about demand, which on average tend to be less critical for these trade models, because they usually add relatively neutral assumptions about demand. You add those two things together, and you can solve for a whole set of what we call endogenous variables. Wages or other factor prices, the prices that the products trade for, where production takes place, and since we know where demand takes place, it gives us trade as well. So our exercise is a little different. So you make these assumptions, a lot of assumptions about the structure of supply and demand, but we actually observe, obviously, a lot of the endogenous variables. So we observe things like trade flows, we observe wages, and we observe prices. So we're going to take these endogenous variables, throw them back at the structure that we're assuming, and use it to identify certain shocks to things like demand and to things like productivity, for example, or trade costs. So we're actually just going to reverse the process a bit. So in a very crude way, we're going to estimate some features of that model. And these are the things that we'll solve for. Productivity, trade frictions, and these demand shares that I mentioned earlier. And the reason why I wanted to simplify it is because in the background, for all countries in the world, we're solving for a set of parameter values, wages, and prices, and technologies that solve these four sets of equations. And there's one of these equations for every country and every sector in every period. Right? So those are the input-output equations. Those are what we refer to as global market clearing conditions. These are equations relating the prices of output to the prices of all of the intermediate inputs and wages, for example, and these are the trade share equations. So in the background, those are the equations we have to solve in order to solve for these particular shocks. That's what goes on. Okay. So we're going to identify demand shocks, deficit shocks, technology shocks, trade friction shocks. We have preferred interpretation for each of these shocks, but you can actually put other interpretations on them because we're not insisting that our particular model is right. There's actually a class of models that will tell a similar story, but it usually has a slightly different interpretation. So for us, this demand parameter here, so the share of expenditures on durable goods, for example, we're going to interpret as a sectoral, as a preference shock. It doesn't have to be a preference shock. Non-homothetic demand can give you the same thing. Since incomes change, the demand shares change. So it doesn't have to be shock to preferences at all. It could actually be something, for instance, that pick up a feature of the inventory cycle. So with the business cycle, inventories tend to decline. So it could be anything that picks that up. Anything that causes a decline in investments in GDP will also affect these things here. Yes?
Didn't you effectively assume away inventory demands?
Yes, if you have we basically class inventory demand as if it was final demand. To us, it looks like it's final demand in our setup. Right. So the reason why we feel not uncomfortable doing that, if you're looking at the very short term, then clearly the inventory cycle could be very important. But within a relatively short period of time, firms are going to restock inventories. And even though firms have begun that process of restocking inventories, the ratio of trade to GDP has actually declined quite a lot. So the inventory cycle is likely to exaggerate what's going on with final demand. Right, so we've decided not to include inventories. There's no real reason why we have to do that. It does dramatically simplify the data collection process because it's hard to find that inventory data for all those countries and sectors. So that's a cost of us trying to do a global model. So as you saw, the inventory paper, the best inventory paper out there, focuses on one industry, the motor vehicle industry, one country, the United States. So if you want to add in extra detail, costs you on some other front. That's the trade-off. Trade deficits, no other interpretation. This parameter here we're interpreting as productivity. It could also be interpreted as a taste shock, but we don't really like that. Nobody really likes that. You could, something that would look similar as you could interpret as a quality shock, but that's not likely over this period of time either. The trade friction, our loose interpretation is a tariff. However, there's many competing things we call it. Higher costs for trade finance have similar effects to tariffs. Sneaky provisions in fiscal stimulus packages will also be picked up by our trade cost measure. Rises in international shipping costs are also picked up. Inventory declines that are specific to imports or that are more pronounced with imports will show up in this variable here. And other trade costs will tend to show up in this variable here. Yes?
What kind of things do you have in mind for productivity shocks? Is this typically something during a recession like the disintermediation of the financial sector, or?
So it could be that, or it could be that workers, for instance, just not working as effectively during the recession. It could be my feeling is that most productivity shocks we observe are just mismeasurement, like at least the big ones. That's usually caused by idle resources, for example. However, our trade models are fundamentally driven by technology assumptions, so we can't just say they're productivity shocks. What it turns out, though, and this is useful, this thing plays no role in the ultimate decomposition. So I'd be a little worried if everything turned out to be because of these productivity shocks, because then I'd be saying our model's not capturing something, right? Something else is driving it. They turn out to explain next to nothing. Right? But in a classical trade model, productivity is obviously a key feature of the model. All right, another thing to simplify things, you see this is inordinately, it's quite, if you read the final version of the paper, it's quite simple to read. If you read some of the earlier versions, it's a disaster. So actually a lot of writing is just trying to take things that are really complex and make them look really simple. It's harder to do that in a presentation. But something that makes things easier is that we're just going to solve for changes in the model. So rather than having to estimate these parameters in both periods, I said, well, how do the parameters have to have changed over this period to explain what we observe? And that actually makes things much simpler. So there's going to be a slight notational change. Usually you see these hats flying around. Whenever we're using a 4-quarter ending change is denoted by this hat variable here. And that also makes things simpler too, because a lot of the data we're working with is not seasonally adjusted. We know there are big seasonal effects in some of these things we're looking at, and taking a 4-quarter ending change is a fairly simple, although not perfect, way of dealing with seasonality. Data is key. Sorry, I have it's 4:30, right?
Right.
So it's really hard to find this data. We eventually found this company that put together trade data at a monthly frequency for about 80 countries. So we bought that data. We decided to minimize our costs by getting it at this 2-digit level to about 97 industries, which are easily aggregated into durable and non-durable sectors. It's easy enough. Production data, that's easier to find but harder to work with. There's lots of sources of production data, but it's usually annual. And the problem is we need higher frequency data because the big decline begins in late 2008 and it bottoms out in the middle of 2009. So we have this challenge. And the way we solve that challenge is that although production data in levels, so like dollars, for example, Deutschmark, euros, is easy to find, you can't find it monthly for most countries. What you can find instead are industrial production indices. So just simply these indexes of industrial production for fairly detailed industries. And they're obviously closely related to the series we're actually interested in. And so we can use this procedure known as temporal disaggregation, where you take an annual series and you relate it to closely related monthly series and use those monthly series to essentially pull apart the annual observation. And so what we use are industrial production and producer price index series. And there are literally thousands of these series available. So we take these series and we then use this temporal disaggregation procedure, which is essentially just a regression, to actually construct or estimate a monthly production level. For some countries, we do have the monthly production data in levels, the stuff, this is what we really want. So we can get some idea about how well our procedure is working. So the US is one of these countries. The line we are trying to hit is the black line. So when we take the US is a little odd. The US still has a larger decline in demand for durables than non-durables, but this is a large decline in non-durable demand. My guess, but it's only a guess, is that this is because of larger amount of consumer demand or US demand for oil, right? And therefore, since there's a large drop in the price of oil, and the US tends to consume a lot of it, that this is something that's kind of infecting their non-durable goods series. That's a guess. We haven't shown that. We don't really need to show that. Okay. Yes?
If we had a relatively larger drop in employment, would that look the same? I mean, would that be an alternative explanation?
No. Only if you have a large drop in employment, it would depend on what happens to the demand of the people. It mostly depends on what those people demand and whether the demand has changed or not. Generally, they stop demanding certain goods. But it also has to have some effect on the production side as well. Remember, this is a share of final demand. So a fall in employment probably affects not numerator and denominator the same way.
Right.
Except for the behavioral effect. When people are scared, they don't buy durable goods. They say, the last thing I want to do when I'm scared is lay out $30,000 for a car. Right? So that's the behavioral effect. So bigger fall in employment, bigger decline in durable goods demand is what you'd expect.
Right. The share thing, I see what you mean. So I'm thinking they quit eating steak too. But
Yeah, that's right. Or they buy a cheaper cut of steak or they eat Alpo. I don't know. One of those things. So, sorry, clear Chicago too long. So essentially, deficits we just take as data. We have nothing to add to the deficit story. What you find in most countries is that most countries move towards trade balance during the crisis. So the deficit countries, the deficit gets lower. So it's certainly true in the United States. The surplus countries, their surpluses get lower. Actually, Japan briefly shifts into deficit. China, surplus gets lower. So the blue line is the overall one. Germany, its surplus gets lower as well. But the movement in the pattern of deficits is something that can affect, we have to take account of, because depending on who's doing the spending and who's doing the producing, because the input-output structure is not the same across countries, we need to take account of that. All right. So we have to identify the trade frictions. So let's just get through this thing here. It turns out we will identify trade frictions as having increased if international transactions decline more rapidly than purely domestic transactions. So you take a pair of countries like the US and Japan. So there's 4 relevant sets of sales for each of our sectors when we're looking at trade frictions. There's the Japan's domestic sales, so what Japanese companies sell to the Japanese. There's US domestic sales, what US companies sell to US. If you look at those 2 lines, they've declined a fair bit in both cases. So both the US and Japan are selling less to the respective residents. The other thing that's relevant is what Japan is selling to the US and what the US is selling to Japan. These are these 2 lines here. Those have fallen much more sharply. And what our trade friction statistics pick up is if the cross-border transactions, these 2 here, decline more rapidly than the within-country transactions, then something has made cross-border transactions relatively more difficult, and we'll identify it as a trade friction. When we compute our statistics, the statistic we're coming up with is essentially something known as a head-re statistic. The lower is the statistic, the more barriers to international trade. Because the lower is the statistic, the less international trade there is. And so what you see for some countries is a decline in these statistics. So it's showing that for some trading relationships, it appears that trade frictions have indeed increased. But for most countries, you don't observe something like that. So for most pairs, the decline in the domestic transactions, the grey and the red, not that out of line with the declines in international transactions, the blue and the black. If you get series of data that look like that, this is what happens to our trade friction statistics. There's no decline on average in trade frictions between that particular bilateral pair. And what it turns out is that for all of the bilateral pairs in the data, that this is much more common than this. And in fact, for some pairs, trade frictions appear to have decreased. So what we do is estimate trade frictions that involve each individual country. Remember, the trade frictions is a bilateral concept, but you might be interested to see, well, what countries have been particularly hurt by changes in trade frictions. So for some countries, they appear to have been hurt. On average, trade frictions that involve Japan seem to have increased. Trade frictions that involve China appear to have increased. Now that doesn't mean that Japan and China themselves have imposed those restrictions. They may have been imposed by the other countries that trade with them. So it doesn't tell you who is imposing the restrictions. And there's some other small countries where you get some increase in trade frictions. But most countries, including most relatively large countries, you don't see an increase. So the US, Mexico, Italy, Germany, most medium to large sized countries, there's no increase. In fact, there's often a decrease in trade frictions. So overall, that suggests that trade frictions might be part of the story, but they're not likely to be a large part of the story overall. So productivity, It's usually just blips, and I think this is mostly due to idle resources that are brief. The resources are idle until the employers get around to firing them, which they do quite quickly. This is actually the distribution of all the trade friction changes. If the whole distribution was centered on 1, then there'd be no change. You tend to see that the typical measure is a little lower than 1, which means on average the typical measure has been a slight increase in trade frictions. So let's all piece this all together. Let me skip that slide. Actually, no, I completely skipped that slide. We used the model and the data to identify those 4 groups of shocks. And now we're going to account for how important are various sets of those shocks. So for instance, if we import none of those shocks, so say let there be no changes to the various shocks, the way we estimate those shocks to begin with is from a particular 4-quarter change in the trade in all of those variables. And so in particular, we look to the depth of the trade experience, so the first quarter of 2009, compared to the first quarter of 2008, which is before any serious global recession was happening. If we input none of those shocks, then by construction, we just get the 2008 quarter 1 result. If we input all of those shocks, by construction, we get the 2009 quarter result. So we say, well, let's input certain combinations of those shocks, such as the demand shocks, the durable goods and the non-durable goods. That way we can come up with some accounting for the importance of the demand shocks in total. But there's a slight caveat here. Our shocks are not orthogonal, so these numbers, when you do these individually, they don't have to add up to the complete sum. Right? So there's a slight caveat in what we're doing. Okay, and here's where we get our graph. The demand shocks are 80% of the story. The durable goods demand shocks are 67% of our story. All the rest is spare change. We can change some of the key assumptions of our model. One thing that we don't estimate is this, you might remember that theta parameter in our model. It governs the dispersion of productivities between countries. So how important the Ricardian explanation for trade actually is. So macroeconomists like low values of theta, trade economists like high values, and some like insanely high values, but they're probably not economists. So basically, regardless of what values the parameters we put in, the demand story is the overwhelming majority of the story. So our assumption on that particular parameter is not likely to be causing the risk. We can do it on a country-by-country basis. The US, it's a demand story. Germany, demand story. But for some countries, demand isn't all of the story. Japan and China, it's actually arguable that the trade friction shocks are actually just as important. So therefore, you can you can say that most of the economists have been right. The trade frictions have been important in some cases. And actually, the Chor and Manova paper and the immediate Weinstein paper looked, in particular, at China and Japan. And so they happened to pick the countries where, in particular, where this relationship was strong. And that's actually one of the potential shortcomings of just an individual country analysis. But since we have the world, or at least 75% of the world accounted for by these individual countries, and the rest of the world together makes up 25% of the world economy, we can tell more. So we can actually look at it on a country-by-country basis. This is the change to trade to GDP in the data. This is the change in trade to GDP in our particular counterfactual when we're accounting for a particular set of shocks. If that set of shocks explains the whole story, everything lines up in the 45-degree line. Right? If we line up in the 45-degree line, we explain the story. This is what happens by just inputting our deficit shocks. Nothing, 5%, close to nothing. It explains a very small part of the story. When you put in the demand shocks, this is the picture. Most of the countries are on the 45-degree line, but some of the countries are way above it. And that means that the model has to associate the extra decline in trade to something else. And what does the model associate this additional decline in trade that China and Japan in fact experienced? To trade frictions. So the countries which, where demand is not the whole story, something else is behind it. And actually, in most cases, it seems that the trade frictions are behind those few countries where demand is not behind the whole story. But the trade frictions are interesting, because if you change trade frictions for some countries, the spillovers, or some of the spillovers, are actually you need to think a bit about, but not that much about. If I make it harder to trade with Japan and China, then a lot of world demand gets diverted onto their competitors. Makes it easier to trade with Korea and, say, Mexico, for instance. Because if I can't get cheap apparel from China, I'm going to get it from Mexico. If I can't get Toyotas from Japan, I'm going to buy Hyundais from Korea. And so essentially, what's offsetting on a global basis some of the trade friction result from these countries here is the fact that some other countries are picking up the slack. Okay. You put all shocks together, lines up in the 45-degree line. That's just construction. If that didn't happen, we'd have to go away and resolve it. Other things we can also do is we're not limited to actually importing all of the shocks of a particular type. We can pick out any particular shock we want and try and see, well, how does this ripple through the world economy? So let's look at just the durable demand shocks for the US. So the US consumers and producers had a reduction in demand for durable goods. What are the biggest impacts? Well, not surprisingly, some of the bigger impacts are on the neighboring countries, Canada, Mexico. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. Because we haven't changed the deficit assumption, when we reduce US demand for durable goods, something has to maintain the deficit. So what happens is that you see a bit of an increase in non-durable goods to try and compensate. You shouldn't focus on that too much. That's just an assumption, what we call a general equilibrium assumption there. Okay. Or trade friction shocks. You add trade friction shocks to, say, China and Japan, what gets affected? The countries that trade the most with China and Japan. The countries that compete the most with China and Japan. And obviously, China and Japan. So you can see how individual shocks ripple through the economy. So if we wanted to, we could try, but we have to think a little more about it, try and see, well, how much of the global recession was, say, something that was domestically sourced in each country, and how much of it was kind of spilled over borders through international trade. So that's something we try to do here, but actually I don't think we've thought about that issue enough, in particular because of the assumptions we make on the deficits. So I would ignore that slide completely. Well, that's on the web now, so my co-authors might see that. So let me skip on quickly. So one other thing that arose by saying, for this recession, fairly clearly on a worldwide basis, that trade decline, the big decline in trade to GDP was a composition story. The decline in demand for goods, especially durable goods. Earlier question, is this unusual for this particular, is this something that happens to other recessions? Okay. Here's the other recession where we have data for most countries still. So this is the beginning of the 2000s. So there's a more mild recession. And again, what you find is the decline in trade to GDP, the black line, is mostly explained by the red line, which are the demand shocks. What's a little more interesting in this period is that this blue line here. This was a period where trade was still being liberalized as a result of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, and also as a result of some large free trade agreements that were still being phased in. You notice that the blue line is typically above 1. What that means is that the blue line is contributing to a secular growth in trade to GDP, which got a little bit interrupted during this recession here. But as soon as the recession was over, the blue line is something that's picking up the growth in trade to GDP. So the secular growth in trade to GDP appears continues to be explained by trade friction results, but the big cyclical movements are mostly explained by demand effects. That doesn't have to be true. So one thing that might be entering your minds is, have we rigged the story? That is our model disposed to give us the result that demand is causing our result? The answer is no. We can go back to the Great Recession, not the Great Recession now, the Great Depression, where I sent some research assistants down into the dusty bowels of the University of Chicago library to dig out a lot of the volumes from the Great Depression. And although you can't construct enough data to estimate our full model, we can actually estimate these trade friction indexes using that head-re statistic, which I actually didn't explain. And so, for a set of US trading partners, we find that for the Great Recession, trade frictions responded according to the red line. So not a lot going on. Remember, this is the US with just a few of its trading partners, 8 trading partners. A small increase in trade frictions. Here's the Great Depression. In a period where we know that countries really increased the trade barriers through massive rises in tariffs and through the destruction of their exchange rate regimes, the data picks it up. In other words, if there was a big increase in trade frictions, our data and our model is eminently well specified to pick it up. And so what's happening today, therefore, is not what happened back in the 1930s. There hasn't been a big wholesale increase in trade frictions. And that's a happy conclusion. Because what it means for the most part is 2 things. One, that the institutions we have set up today have been good enough to resist the worst of the protectionist sentiment that clearly exists in countries. Everybody wants to protect their own in the crisis. But the institutions have managed to somehow, for now at least, postpone that, or maybe defer it altogether. But the other thing it suggests is, as soon as the economy begins to recover, which it has in most developing countries, but is only very slowly recovering in the developed world, the trade will resume its upward trend, and that essentially this healthy growth in international business is something that will resume. And that's basically our story. There's been a huge drop in trade GDP in this most recent recession, the biggest since the Great Depression. In fact, sharper earlier decline than the Great Depression. Our model says that most of it is due to consumers changing the composition of demand, or producers changing the composition of demand. When they feel poorer, and when the economy is a little slower, consumers don't buy automobiles, producers don't invest in plant and equipment, and that's most of the story. Only about 20% can be explained by other factors, of which not all of those are trade frictions. So once the economy gets back on a sounder footing, we don't think that any lasting damage, or much lasting damage, has been done to the world trading system, so it can continue contributing to world prosperity the way it probably has done for the last 60 years. That's the paper.